In the United States, we have a tradition of political liberalism in matters of religion. This means citizens generally expect government to respect and to protect people's right to practice religion according to their own values. Political liberalism has its roots in 18th century Europe and emerges in response to the European wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants. Starting in the Middle Ages, feudal authorities become prominent patrons of religion and protectors of certain religious prerogatives. They establish churches, support them financially, and sometimes exercise influence in the appointment of bishops. Religion is seen as a key teacher of morality, so governments are concerned to ensure good religion prevails among its people. Following the Protestant Reformation, this practice continues. When a sovereign, a prince, a king, or a queen, changes religious affiliation from Catholic to Protestant or from Protestant to Catholic, whether motivated by political or religious goals, they deploy military power to enforce this change. Churches get destroyed, and too often members of the banished religion face displacement or death. Political liberalism gains consensus in response to this disruption in almost all of Europe by the end of the 18th century. Governments start to treat religion as a private matter and tolerate differences in religious practice. Secularism becomes a political goal. Governments replace the churches in directing public schools, running hospitals, and giving care to the poor. In Europe, religion is still seen as a key influence on personal morality well into the 20th century. European political liberals, however, see the moral instruction provided by a secular school system as an important counterbalance to religious morality. The movement away from established official churches and toward the privatization of religious observance is called the disestablishment of religion. Disestablishment of religion from government institutions turns religion into a private concern, the responsibility of persons and families, and not of government. From a legal perspective, the United States disestablishes religion from the institutions of federal government with the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Individual states retain constitutional authority to establish official churches until Reconstruction from the Civil War, when the 14th Amendment applies First Amendment liberties to state governments. The First Amendment has two clauses pertaining to religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The first clause, called the Establishment Clause, means that the federal government shall not establish an official religion. The second clause, called the Free Exercise Clause, also prohibits the federal government from preventing citizens from practicing their religion. These two clauses create some tension. For example, when the U.S. military deploys personnel away from their homes, it can be hard for the enlisted personnel to practice their religion. Should the military then hire religious ministers to serve military personnel? On the one hand, this government support to religion could be seen as running contrary to the Establishment Clause. But if the government does not allow soldiers to access ministers from their religious traditions, it seems like they are impeding the free exercise of religion. It's easy to see then how Americans still argue today about the appropriate balance between these two clauses of the First Amendment. The disestablishment of religion from the constitutional institutions of government is not the only way political liberalism influences people's views about the role for religion in society. Scholars of religion sometimes refer to three disestablishments of religion from American social life. The first disestablishment is the disestablishment of religion from the constitutional institutions of government. In the U.S., that's the First and 14th Amendments. The second disestablishment of religion refers to the disestablishment of religion from civil society. And the third refers to the disestablishment of religion from public morality. When we look at how social life is organized in the United States, sociologists commonly speak of multiple spheres that constitute a society. Each sphere has its dominant institutional forms and distinctive cultural practices. But how sociologists distinguish one sphere from another depends in part on what a given theorist or researcher wants to focus on. For this lecture, we will look at a three-part division between the public sphere, the private sphere, and civil society. The public sphere refers to the constitutional institutions of government. The private sphere refers to the world of intimate relationships between family and friends, but also profit-seeking business activities. The third sphere, that of civil society, refers to a broad segment of associational life, groups and organizations that people join. In this model, what we call civil society includes the nonprofit sector, churches, charitable organizations, and membership organizations. In the United States, Protestant Christianity remains prominent in civil society until after the Second World War. Many nonprofit organizations had a Protestant cultural ethos. For example, if you wanted to join a club, its membership committee might require a recommendation from a local Protestant pastor. Catholics and Jews then were not welcome. Or if you joined a civic organization like Rotary, the YMCA, or the Chamber of Commerce, meetings would start with a Protestant devotional practice. Public schools commonly taught the Ten Commandments and used reading textbooks that reinforced Protestant cultural norms. Until the mid-20th century, people tended to live in neighborhoods that were ethnic enclaves. Protestants might have ideas about Catholics and Jews, and invariably some of these were prejudices. But many Protestants had few, if any, Catholic friends, few, if any, Jewish friends. Following World War II, a surge of patriotism encourages people to see each other first and foremost as Americans. Catholic and Jewish families had also sent children to war. Another social phenomena helps bring the hegemony of Protestant culture and American civic life to an end: the rise of suburbs. When suburbs expand during the 1950s, white Protestants, white Catholics, and Jews who could afford a home in these suburbs often found themselves living next door to people who had different religious practices. Friendly neighbors with diverse religious backgrounds undermined old prejudices. Congregations built churches and synagogues in the suburbs, and when driving past these buildings, they all seemed similar. Catholics and Jews joined the white American middle class and are typically seen then as equal participants in the American mainstream. These changes encounter political opposition in some sectors. Anti-Semitism, for example, remains a force even today. Because of discrimination in housing, however, Blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans were excluded from this cultural melting pot. With these social changes, we see the gradual diminishment of Protestant culture and the emergence of a shared secular culture in the institutions and practices of civil society. Religion is seen less as a public concern and more of part of a person's private life. Parents encourage their children not to discuss religion in polite company, and children who grow up together in a neighborhood see each other as friends, despite how they worship at home or on the weekends. The third disestablishment, the disestablishment of Protestant morals from public morality, does not happen immediately. Protestant culture recedes from civic life, but Protestant morals continue to offer a consensus for what's considered morally decent. Protestant morality could be described with reference to three key values: industry, family values, and moderation and consumption. These values continue to serve as a shared standard of moral decency in public life. Though clubs might now accept Catholics and Jews as members, they might choose not to accept someone who has had a divorce, someone who they think does not work hard, or someone who seems to waste money, drink too much alcohol, or use any other kind of drug. Gradually, each of these prongs of Protestant morality falls out of a consensus on the standards of public morality in the United States. These values remain important for large numbers of Americans, and they figure prominently in public discussions and debates about moral issues. But these values no longer serve as a shared consensus view of who is morally decent and who might not be morally decent. One by one, these values becomes contested, which means subject to debate. The Protestant value for moderation calls for frugality and moderation in economic consumption. With the expansion of mass media, advertising that valorizes economic consumption challenges Protestant value for frugality. Buying things, people now say, is good for you, good for the economy, good even for the country. The classic Protestant value for moderation also calls for temperance, which means either refraining from drinking alcohol altogether or not drinking so much as to become intoxicated. Seeing addiction as a medical problem and not a moral failing, and the decriminalization of public intoxication challenge Protestant value for temperance. This trend continues to the present day, with debate about decriminalizing or legalizing other recreational drugs. Classic Protestant morality has some standards around family values. It calls for sexual abstinence when a person is single and fidelity in married life. It holds for traditional gender roles. Men would work and provide for the family. Women would run the home and raise the children. Starting in the 1960s, the expansion of at-will divorce from state to state, the rise of the women's movement, reliable birth control technology, and the sexual revolution that follows from reliable birth control technology all work to challenge Protestant mores around family, gender, and sex. Though debate continues today, particularly about the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people, the most prominent vestige of Protestant public morality is value for industry, which generates expectations that people work hard and support themselves economically. Yet today we see broad political support for Social Security, unemployment insurance, and Medicare. A majority of Americans also favor Medicaid, temporary aid to needy families, food stamps, and the Affordable Care Act. All of these government programs attenuate Americans' values for the Protestant virtue of self-reliance. Moreover, as Congress decreased the rate of estate taxes on the wealthiest Americans, what they can leave for their children and grandchildren, a few prominent billionaires did object, but most Americans seem not to worry about the morality of handing significant amounts of unearned wealth to the next generation. Most Americans, however, still see work as a good in and of itself and not merely as a means to an end. We still have public morality in the U.S. As Protestant morality has receded in prominence, toleration and respect for individual freedom have become the new majority position on public morality. Americans take these two values together. Tolerance is a way of respecting individual freedoms in matters of morality. It is generally not a value in and of itself. For example, most Americans do not choose to tolerate intolerance because intolerance does not respect individual freedom. What does this mean for religion and public life? Many Americans today associate religion with intolerance, and the intolerant attitudes of a small number of well-publicized religious leaders tends to reinforce this perception. So when Catholic social teaching enters the public arena of civil society and points to certain social issues that toleration alone cannot solve, the position provokes some people who think that Catholicism should not be speaking out on politics. Catholic social teaching calls people to respect those who are poor, to honor the rights of workers, to work for ecological sustainability. And many Americans consider this an unwelcome intrusion of religion into public life. This position, too, produces some tensions. The position that people who have religious values shouldn't speak on politics, this position, too, introduces some tensions and raises some questions. First, should we equate a religion with the most obnoxious actions of the most extreme representatives of the religious sector? Second, are religious values to be treated differently from values associated with other social sectors like health or science, business or sport or politics. We do find a broad range of support for the aims of Catholic social teaching outside of the Catholic community. Catholics are not the only people who think we all have a responsibility to work to make society better. Catholics are not the only people who value the rights of workers, and they're not the only people who are promoting ecological sustainability. So the question becomes, should religiously minded people and religious groups be treated differently simply because religion motivates their public engagement? Religious diversity has increased in the United States since the 1960s. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 leads to increased religious diversity in the U.S. One of the goals for this legislation is to eliminate discrimination on the basis of race in American immigration policy. This legislation then led to much more cultural diversity than the United States had known previously, and the American religious landscape became more diverse than ever before. Many Americans now think we should further secularize civic life so we can forge a national consensus among Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, Jews, atheists, and people with no religious affiliation or affinity whatsoever. As we celebrate cultural diversity in our civic spaces, a question emerges. Should we exclude religious cultures from these celebrations? With most things in American public life, consensus emerges through discussion and debate. The place religion holds or ought to hold in society will ultimately depend on how Americans choose to negotiate the relationships between each other. So the question becomes, how will you contribute to the discussion about the place for religion in society? What do you consider the appropriate contributions for religion in public life?